Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this virtual event. My name is Dr. Steph Hinnershitz, and I am a non-resident fellow with the National World War II Museum's Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. And today I'm really excited to have a special guest, author Mary McNeil, with us to talk about her book, Century's Witness, The Extraordinary Life of Journalist Wallace Carrol. Mary, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a real treat to be able to speak to you today.
Absolutely. So I can't think of anyone better to have written this book. Mary's career is impressive and very wide-ranging. She is a former editor and writer for the Congressional Quarterly and the primary author of Environment and Health, Reagan's First Year and the Nuclear Age. She has worked as an editor at the Smithsonian Institution and the National Academy of Sciences, and as a journalist at the Winston-Salem Journal. During a 28-year career at the World Bank, she launched 2 global publications, The Urban Age and Development Outreach, and wrote Demanding Good Governance, Lessons from Social Accountability Initiatives in Africa. A graduate of Wake Forest University and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, she resides in Washington, D.C. with her husband and 3 daughters. Century's Witness is her first full-length biography and has received many accolades, including the Gold Medal from the Indie's Best Books, the IBPA Benjamin Franklin Awards, and is a finalist for the Sperber Award, which is given annually by Fordham University, especially for biographies and memoirs of journalists. So again, really excited to have you here today, Mary. And I wanted to start off with a question that I'm always interested in, and I think our audience will be interested in. This book spans the career of Carrol. He is a phenomenal, interesting figure, wide-ranging, of course, because we're hosting you with the National World War II Museum. We're going to spend a decent amount of time talking about his war experiences. But just to start off, what got you interested in Carrol? What is it about this book that you felt need to be written and the story need to be told?
Right. Well, thank you again. I got first interested in the book, I guess, because I knew Wallace Carrol. I was a student of his back in the 70s. At the end of his career, he taught at Wake Forest University, where I went to school, and he was retired at that time, but he taught a course on the First Amendment. And we didn't know anything about his background as students because he didn't talk about himself. But there was something about him that you knew was remarkable. He was quiet, but he had a lot of charisma, and you just wanted to do well for him. And then the more I got into the story, when I was finding out all of the things that he did, I recognized what you had just mentioned. The scope of his career was quite remarkable. He was a working journalist for 45 years, from 1929 to 1974, and covered, or at least wrote about, most of the historic events that took place during that time. And he was a remarkable figure in that he went from the international stage to the national stage to the local stage as a journalist. And I think now that's important because we have such problems with local journalism and the death of many local newspapers. And this was a man who left at the height of his career to basically go to a smaller community where he felt he could have some influence. And he sort of shunned the limelight to do that. And that made me like him. That made me want to shine some light on someone who I thought was hugely influential in his time, but wasn't famous and didn't seek fame. And I thought that was also something worth covering. And just lastly, I am a history buff. I was a history major in college. One reason I'm so delighted to be speaking to you today. But if you're a history buff, his life was unbelievably interesting in terms of the 20th century, beginning with and leading up into World War II, but beyond that, all the way through the Vietnam War.
Yeah, it really is this story. I love this book, and there's nothing better than to be able to look at the life of someone and follow them throughout this time period. I love stories that are able to do that. And I also really appreciated just how humble he was and how he always put the career and the state of journalism sort of at a higher level above him. So that was really admirable. The other thing that I thought was interesting was you spent a good amount of time setting the stage for the world of journalism that Carrol kind of came up in. So I think it would be interesting for our audience to hear a little bit about what did the world of journalism look like when Carroll was kind of coming of age, and how that may have shaped his approach to journalism during the war years and beyond.
Sure, that's a great question. Wallace Carroll graduated from Marquette University in 1928 and promptly went to work for United Press in Chicago. And at the time, I guess you could say there was a lot of what we now call tabloid or yellow journalism. There was a lot of hyperbole in journalistic stories. Many of the big papers were owned by the big media bosses, like William Randolph Hearst was one, and the other were the McCormicks in Chicago. And I think the reporting was really not as in depth at all as what we've come to expect it to be. And I think Carroll fit into that when he got out of school. His first story was covering the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago in 1929. And he really waxed prosaic about the bloodletting in his story, and he really made it dramatic. At the time he started working, there were the news services, Associated Press and also United Press. And Carroll went to work for United Press. And at that time, United Press was the upstart news service. And it was started by E.W. Scripps in 1907. And what he wanted was a news service that really questioned corporate power. It was a news service he wanted to focus on the common person. He wanted it to be anti-corruption. And the other big news service, Associated Press, which had been around much longer, was much more well-heeled and a little bit less oriented that way. So Carroll jumped into United Press. He worked for the news service for 15 years, and he went to Europe as a United Press correspondent after only working for his boss, who sent him to Europe for 6 months in Chicago. So there was obviously something about a 22-year-old that instilled confidence in someone that they would allow them to go to Europe like that after such small experience, basically working in Chicago. And I think that Carroll began his career, and even when he was in college, writing some pretty dramatic copy. And I think he evolved, but we can talk about how that happened later in his career.
Yeah, another great thing about your book is you have some excerpts from his writing at different stages throughout his career. And it is interesting to kind of follow him as he grows up in the world of journalism. And you're absolutely right. Some of these early passages are beautifully written, but they're really like dynamic, and he does evolve with his style. So I really, really enjoyed that. And going back to your point about how he was able to enter into this career at such a young age and on such a level, would you say it's fair to refer to him as one of our first kind of foreign correspondents? Is that a fair description to give to him?
I think it is, because at the time, we now have a rather glamorous view of foreign correspondence. And I think at the time that was not necessarily the case. A lot of reporters that went overseas and a lot of managers of even the news services overseas, they would take government reports that were issued and basically run them. They would go to press conferences with government and basically repeat what the government wanted them to say. There was very little eyewitness reporting. And when Carroll got to London, one characteristic of United Press reporters is you had to have a lot of chutzpah. You didn't have anybody really backing you up. You had very little training. So you had to figure out on your own how to do things. And one of the things that Carroll figured out very quickly was that he wanted to be an eyewitness reporter. He wanted to be in the middle of things. And often that was a rather dangerous enterprise. This is in the early 1930s in London and in Paris, when there were a lot of riots happening, hunger riots in London, for example, and then riots between the left, which was head of the government in Paris at the time, and the right, and clashes that became quite violent. And Carroll put himself right in the middle of that and was able to report on that, which was somewhat unique. Now, he wasn't the only one doing it, but he was at the forefront of that kind of reporting. In fact, he went to a riot in Paris, and he was standing next to a fellow. This is all very vividly described in the book. And the fellow got shot right next to him, a 24-year-old, and Carroll picked him up. He was bleeding and tried to carry him to the US Embassy. By the time he got there, the fellow had died. And Carroll didn't see that he had been doing anything. There was a random firing into the mob, and this poor guy got hit. But he said, I did run to the phone and file my report as soon as possible. So he was a very adventurous person and displayed quite a lot of courage too, which I think if you saw him, you would be a bit surprised about, because he didn't come across as an extroverted, sort of gregarious person. He was a rather quiet, dignified person, but he had a lot of adventure in him to be able to do that.
Yeah, I loved how you brought up his experiences in the 30s in Europe as this one of our first foreign correspondents, because he really has his finger on the pulse of some things that are going on in Europe early on in the 1930s. And he uses some of these events that he covered to start to be concerned about trends that were happening in terms of radicalism on different sides. And he's very concerned about some issues that are starting to arise and come up that will lead directly into World War II. So to jump ahead a little bit, how does Carroll get to Europe? How does he stay there right at the outbreak of World War II? What was it that got him there and sort of encouraged him to stay there?
Well, his boss at the time in Chicago was a guy who really had an international perspective. His name was Earl Johnson. And Earl Johnson really was worried about what was going on in Europe as early as 1929. And I think one of the reasons he got sent to Europe when he did was because Johnson wanted someone on the ground that he could trust, that could report back on the things that were going on there. I mean, he soon became the head of United Press International, and he soon became the bureau chief in Berlin. This is Earl Johnson. So he knew something was coming. He could sense that the storm was brewing. And I think that may be one reason why he sent Carroll. And after Carroll had been in London for 2 years and then Paris for 2 years, he was assigned again by Earl Johnson to cover the League of Nations in 1934. Now, the League of Nations was a great place if you wanted to be kin to the dialogue going on. And the diplomatic, we know they were failed diplomatic efforts, but diplomatic efforts to stem the rise of fascism. You had Mussolini in Italy, you had the rise of Hitler in 1933. Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. So, I think UP recognized what they had in Carroll. He was someone that could see, I like to describe him as someone who could see the big picture and the small picture. He was very analytical, very intelligent, and I think he could interact with the diplomats one-on-one. He was able to converse with them. He had the background, he had the knowledge, and therefore he had their trust. So I think that was another reason they wanted him in Europe, because he had that kind of ability. Many journalists at the time were great writers or they were great adventurers, but they didn't necessarily have that broad perspective on diplomacy. And I think that was his big advantage and why he got these assignments at such a young age.
Mm-hmm. So I don't want to take away from the spotlight for Carroll, because obviously he's the focus here, but I also don't want to lose an opportunity to talk about another very important person in this book and in Carroll's life, and that's his wife, Peggy. So could you talk a little bit about how important Peggy was for Carroll's career, but also just her own role in making sure that this new world of journalism and war reporting really did start to blossom at this time?
Sure, and we have a couple of photos we can show following this, but when I was writing the book and interviewing people who knew both Wallace and Peggy Carroll, many times I was told, well, Peggy was the real story to write about. And Peggy Carroll was an extremely vibrant, intelligent, well-educated woman. She went to Vassar. She graduated in 1936, and she met Gil Wynant, who at the time was head of the International Labor Organization in Geneva. He was in the US for a conference. And he immediately recognized something in her and invited her to come and work with him in Geneva. And so she was in Geneva when Wallace Carroll was there, and they met there. They traveled in the same circles. And her father had been the head of the Rockefeller Health Institute and one of the first founders of a yellow fever vaccine. And she had grown up living all over the world. And we have some fun pictures. There's a great picture of her in front of the pyramids. This is Wallace Carrol when he was a young correspondent in Europe, taken, I think this was somewhere outside of Paris, this was taken. And then the next photo, if we could show it, is of Peggy Carroll with her father. Peggy's in the middle, her father on the left, and this is at the top of the pyramids when she's 11 years old. So she had quite an international background. She was very outgoing, very effervescent, and she played a key role in his career and his life. One of the wonderful things about the book is I got her letters when I was towards the end of the book. And she wrote her mother very religiously every day. And I don't want to get ahead of myself either. She was, of course, with Carol in London during the Blitz. And these letters were so vivid. And they also really showed the love story between the two of them in that they were perfectly matched. He was much more quiet, much more introverted. She was much more extroverted. But together, they had a common intelligence, a common sense of adventure, and a common sense of values, if I can say that really made them a formidable couple. So from the point where he met her, I tried to keep her in the story as much as I could because she was such a part of the story.
Yeah, and you definitely succeed in that, because at no point when I was reading this book did I have this impression that she was a side character or that she wasn't integral. Like sometimes that happens in books where the wife is there, she's very wifely, but she doesn't do much in the book, and you definitely don't portray Peggy like that at all. She is there with him, she moves throughout the war, and she's also just a really great character. But to go back to something you brought up, and that you don't want to get ahead of yourself, so now we can jump into some of Carol's wartime reporting. To be a little bit selfish, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was his time in Barcelona. So could you talk a little bit about, before we get to London and the Blitz, but what kind of impact did his time in Barcelona, what he did there, have on his journalism and his reporting?
Sure. Well, Carroll had been in Europe and he had been in violent situations, but he'd never been in a war. He had never seen high-level bombing. He had never really been to the front lines. And so in 1938, he realized that the reporting coming out of the League of Nations was not being very effective, and as was the League of Nations not being very effective. And at the time, everybody, all the reporters, Ernest Hemingway, John Dos Passos, were going to the Spanish Civil War to report on it. So he decided he would go. And he went and he landed in Barcelona. He made his way to Madrid, to near the front lines, and then he made his way back to Barcelona. But in the interim, he got sick. He got dysentery from eating some fruit by the side of the road. And so he was very, very sick. And he was literally sort of feeling his way along buildings in Barcelona to get back to his hotel. And at that time, they were arresting the Republicans who were in charge of Barcelona, were arresting those they thought were insurgents against the Republican regime. And a policeman came and arrested him and threw him on a bus where other insurgents were. And everyone knew that that bus went out at the end of the day and these insurgents were shot. And they were all praying and screaming and yelling. And here he was, sick as could be, on this bus. And by happenstance, someone he knew from the British Foreign Ministry walked by. He called out to him. And as Carroll said, he waited a little bit. But then he said, "Oh, I know this fellow. He's an American journalist. You should let him off the bus." And so he was let off the bus. And so he had some pretty hair-raising experiences there, being ill. And he also reported quite movingly on the civilian population there. And I think he saw firsthand how difficult war is on the innocent civilian population. He talked about all the underground tunnels that had been dug for people to hide in. He talked about the lack of food. And I think it had a real strong influence on him in terms of how horrible, if I may say, the war was, because again, he had seen it for the first time firsthand.
Definitely. And this is also something that's going to shape his reporting when he gets to London and covers the Blitz. And so you do spend a lot of time, rightfully so, in this book discussing this moment. So can you tell the audience, without giving the story away, we want them to read your book, but can you tell us a little bit about his experiences there, how it continued to shape his reporting, how it made him feel about war, perhaps? Just sort of fill us in a little bit on his time there.
Well, and it is important, I think, to talk about this in the context of what influences you as a journalist. He was having the bombs fall on him and his wife. And I have several pretty hair-raising incidents in the book where they talk about where they make, escapes, but lucky escapes from really being harmed. And I think that, again, what was maddening, I think, to Carroll was that while all of this was going on, he was writing, or he had his staff write. When he went to London, he had never managed an office before, but they put him in charge of 75 reporters all throughout the country. So he was in charge of he had a very responsible position. And, but all the reports, even though they were appearing on the front pages of many newspapers across the country, Americans, as you know, were still very isolationist and were not getting, I think, how terrible it was. And I think the reporting he did and his colleagues, and we all know Edward R. Murrow, who was a good friend of his and whose office was right across from his, basically in London, what an effect their reporting had. But I think that it was almost a sense of desperation when you're reporting on this and you're not convincing people that you're even telling the truth. There's a very interesting story, and I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit, because I was just on a panel about trust in the media and was asked to give an anecdote about that in respect to Wallace Carroll. And after the war, Wallace Carroll came back, and he, in 1942, not after the war, but he came back to the United States in 1942, and he gave a talk to the Council of Engineers at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. And after he had given his talk about all his experiences in the Blitz, and by that time he'd been to Russia, the first question, a man stood up and said, "Okay, now was London really bombed, or was that all just newspaper talk?" And he said, "I would have beamed him with my plate if I could have gotten to my plate quick enough." But I think all of this, is context for understanding how important he thought reporting and telling the truth to people was. And it could be frustrating, but he felt he really felt compelled to do that, getting the message, getting across what's going on. And in the end, the journalists like Murrow and others, they did have a big effect, because in the end, American opinion did sway towards supporting England. And it also should be remembered that many newspapers at the time were supportive of Hitler in the late 30s. The Hearst newspapers, again, the Chicago papers, they oftentimes were saying, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with Hitler. It's not so bad. We shouldn't do it." So it was a calling for him, I think, because of what he had witnessed and how he had seen this emerge on the continent over many years. And in that, he was unique in that he had had that kind of experience leading up to and into the war.
Yeah, you certainly make a central point in your book, just how hard he fought to get Americans to care about what was going on. And I think that's another good example of using journalism for humanitarian efforts, sort of this higher calling, this higher purpose than just reporting or even doing sensationalized reporting. And what I came away with is his reporting style was a little unique, like from some of the ones that you had mentioned, that it was more analytical without simply stating the facts. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is. I think it was part of his evolution as a journalist. I think he really came to define it later in the 1950s when he gave a lot of talks about the basic principles of journalism as he saw them. And as I said, I do think that's what put him in a little different category than a lot of other writers. You probably have read and studied a lot of Ernie Pyle's writings. I've just recently been reading through them, and what a remarkable writer that Ernie Pyle was. And I think Carroll was a good writer, but I'm not sure that was his chief talent. I think his chief talent was analysis, his disposition, which was very calm, his trustworthiness, his intelligence, his understanding of the big picture, history, and that kind of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting to see the differences between we do a lot with Ernie Pyle at the museum, so it's a different angle and a different take on World War II reporting, which I found really interesting. The other thing,
one of the things, just quickly, because
yeah,
I was so excited because I was reading Ernie Pyle's dispatches from England during the war, and there's an exact overlap between what he wrote and what Wallace Carroll wrote when they were watching the bombing of St. Paul's Cathedral, standing on the rooftop of a hotel. And I found it just made me think about, in addition to covering all these events, Carroll basically knew everybody. Didn't talk about who he knew, but you know, it's when the index was done for the book, I mean, of all the figures he knew in the course of his life, it was pretty amazing. And Ernie Pyle, I think, was a good friend, and obviously they had influence on one another.
Yeah, I would say that also with his reporting, he made a lot of perilous journeys. So he was just these fabulous, although terrifying, but fabulous descriptions of how he got from point A to point B and how he covered that. So he goes to the Eastern Front. He eventually returns from Moscow and comes back to the US. And just quickly, how is he connected to Pearl Harbor? So what is the deal with his journey in Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, this is another reason why I sometimes laughingly refer to him as the Forrest Gump of World War II. Well, when the Blitz was over, when it was in a lull, in 1941, the end of 1941, was when obviously the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in September. And, you know, as I say in the book, he and Peggy had just begun to breathe a sigh of relief when his boss again called him and said, "Can you get to the Russian front?" And one of the reasons his boss did that was because he had met with George Marshall. And George Marshall had asked a bunch of editors in to try to ask them to find out what was going on with the Soviet army, because they really didn't know what was going on with the Soviet army, and they wanted the journalists to help them find out. So that was another reason that Earl Johnson sent Wallace Carroll. And of course he goes, well, okay, great idea, but how do I get there? So he has this incredible journey up through the Arctic Circle in one of the first convoys to go into the Soviet Union. He's in Moscow, then he's forced to leave. Stalin had all the journalists leave when the Nazis were right at the gates. He goes to a place called Kubyshev, which is what he called a forlorn place in Russia where they sent everybody. And then he realizes he can't get any stories out from there, so he's got to get home. So literally by camel, rowboat, train, truck, he makes this incredible 6-week journey across the Asian continent. And remember, this is not now. This is 1942, when travel was not that easy. And he literally gets all the way to the Philippines. Then he gets on a ship, and the ship is scheduled to arrive in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. But it is inexplicably delayed by a couple days, so it arrives a few days later. But the fact that he saw that scope of the war and just happened to land in Pearl Harbor 3 days after the attack is pretty amazing. And so therefore, he was one of the first to report on the devastation. He knew the information officer for Admiral Kimmel, who let him go around on a skiff to look at the bombing, effects of the bombing. But he wasn't allowed to report on it at that time because they didn't want this extent of the devastation to get out. But you know, to make that journey, it is fun to read in the book because he literally does everything he can to put together a way to get home. And it's quite adventurous, very adventurous. And just as an aside, the reason I have all this material is that later in his life, he made tapes of his adventures as a foreign correspondent, or he actually gave talks that were taped to the Winston-Salem community. And I was able to get those tapes. And he was just an incredible storyteller. So facts, the details of all of this journey and all his time in Russia, his escape from Moscow, I was able to put in the book, and it was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, they are great, great journeys and very, very detailed. So he comes back, misses Pearl Harbor, comes back to the US, and he starts to work with the Office of War Information. So can you tell us a little bit about what that agency is and what was his role in it?
Yeah, I mean, this is where there's some new history that I found from Wallace Carroll's papers in the Library of Congress. The Office of War Information was an agency that was set up by Roosevelt in 1942 to basically coordinate information about the war, okay? And it had two branches. It had a domestic branch, which was to basically, I guess, keep morale high for support of the war domestically. And then there was an overseas branch, which was to send messages to primarily people in countries that had been conquered by the Nazis, because they also wanted to keep the morale up. And the head of that was a guy named Elmer Davis. And Elmer Davis was a very popular radio announcer during the time. And Roosevelt wanted him because he was seen as pretty neutral in terms and down to earth in terms of his coverage of the war and what he thought the war aims should be. So Wallace Carroll was made the deputy to Elmer Davis and put in charge of the European branch from London. So he went back to London. This is in the end of 1942, beginning 1943. And while he was there, he had a couple of things he was charged with doing, one of which was to let the British people know what Americans were like, because they knew that American soldiers were going to be descending on England, and they wanted the British to be ready for them. And there's some also interesting stories, and Peggy helped him with this because she was also working with Gil Wynant then, who was the US ambassador to England during the war. And then he started doing what we would now call propaganda for the people in occupied Europe. And this involved a lot of different things, preparing radio broadcasts, preparing leaflets, dropping leaflets. They had a huge leaflet campaign that they did in conjunction with the RAF and the US Air Force and things like that. And it turned out to be a pretty big operation. The British were very good at propaganda, and the Americans less so, I think. And Carroll admitted he went into it not really knowing how to do it. But he had excellent contacts with the British. They really trusted him. And so he was doing a very good job with them. But then some issues arose. I don't know if you want me to go into it, but basically his boss, number two to Elmer Davis, was a guy named Robert Sherwood, who was a very famous playwright and was Franklin Roosevelt's speechwriter. And while he was a brilliant playwright, he was a horrible administrator. And he was based in New York, and he would not respond to Carroll's messages. He would send conflicting messages about what should be done. And Carroll was trying very hard to coordinate American and British efforts. And so it got to a point where he just couldn't deal with it anymore. And so he resigned at the end of 1943.
Yeah, I also appreciated your discussion of propaganda because it perhaps isn't quite what we think of as propaganda, or at least not the negative way that we think of it. And Carroll really did see it as a tool to be able to keep American support of the war going, and really it was a humanitarian undertaking for him. So I thought that was also a really interesting approach to that as well.
Yeah. He at the time, he did not see propaganda as not telling the truth. He saw it more about what you withhold and what you tell. And remember, he was up against the best propagandists we've seen in the 20th century, barring people who shall go unnamed, but Joseph Goebbels. And, he knew that they had to keep the morale of people in Europe up, and he knew that they needed to support military efforts with an information campaign. And he thought that was very, very important, because that is what would convince people's hearts and minds, as he liked to say, of what the US was trying to do militarily. So when I started the book, I really wondered, oh my gosh, a journalist going into propaganda. But remember, this was a world war. and the goal was to beat Hitler. And if you had to sort of be more on the propaganda side in the sense of making sure your messages were going along in a certain way to support what the Allied effort was doing, then you were going to do it because that was the goal. And I think that was how he justified it. And I think he felt good that he was he was making an effort that maybe went beyond just being a reporter at that point in his life.
Right, absolutely. I don't want to jump ahead too much because the book is obviously very focused on World War II, but I think this is a good place to talk about what he does after the war. And what I found interesting about sort of his post-war years, or the lead up to the post-war years, has to do with the museum is opening a new pavilion in November. So the Liberation Pavilion, which is all dedicated to post-war efforts,
a
global, a domestic point. And I thought it was fascinating that Carroll, probably building off of his experience working with the Office of War Information and Propaganda, had his own plan for how to help Germany kind of rebuild after the war. He didn't necessarily get a chance to carry through with those, but what was his own approach or belief about how to rebuild Germany when the war was over?
Right. Well, he actually went into Germany at the close of the war. He and Elmer Davis were able to fly into Germany and to see some of the devastation. And he didn't think the way to do it was to come in with flags waving and talking about how great the United States was and what a conqueror they had been and so on and so forth. But he did feel that the Germans needed to have a sense of guilt about what they had done, and that needed to be established first. Because until they understood what had happened, because remember, these people had been living many of them in a perverted, unreal world in terms of the messages they had been getting for years from Hitler and Goebbels. So he really felt that was important that they recognize and take that into consideration. And then he wrote a book in 1948 that was all about propaganda called Persuade or Perish. And I think the main message there is that he really felt that moving into the Cold War, you couldn't just wield a strong stick in the sense of scaring people about nuclear weapons or what you were going to do militarily. You also had to work, again, on their hearts and minds. And therefore, the messages that you crafted were important, and getting messages out were important. During the war, he had been one of the founders of the Voice of America. And I think he felt that kind of effort was really needed moving into the Cold War. And I think also, you haven't asked me about his mistakes, which he did make a couple, but I just want to say, I think he went into the war having trust in the Russians, possibly. He did come back thinking that the Russians could beat the Nazis. But I think he pretty quickly found out how bad Stalin was after the war. And I think he felt a little duped by what he had said. And he did become a kind of a cold warrior. I mean, he did think the Soviet Union was a threat, and he did think they were not trustworthy. And I think that colored his reporting a little bit as he moved ahead.
Yeah, that's another good characteristic, I would say, admirable of him, is he was able to self-reflect. And there were certainly points where he looked back and said, I got this wrong. That was an example. Another was Japanese American incarceration. He admits later on, like, I definitely know that was not my best moment. I did not get that right. And be great if more journalists could
well, I think, and I think he learned another lesson, which is one of his key principles, is responsibility. You know, as a journalist, you have a lot of freedom, but you have to think about the effect of what you write and what that's going to do. And I think when he did sort of overstate the Japanese American, spying a little bit in Pearl Harbor and felt terrible about it, I think it brought home to him how dangerous it is to report on things and the effect they can have. And I think that was a good lesson, and he did learn it. I think he learned it very well from that specific, incident.
Yeah, and you can see this. Like I said, we focused a lot on World War II today for obvious reasons, but definitely can see how his experiences during the war, some of these principles that he develops while he's reporting, affects his life later on. So can you tell us a little bit about what did he do after the war? What about his longer career? What kind of impact did he have on journalism there?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I'm not sure I have the full story, but he spent a couple years writing his book after the war, and then he was approached by a guy named Gordon Gray, who at that time was I think he was at that time Secretary of Defense, actually, but he was also Chancellor of the University of North Carolina Schools. And also he owned the Winston-Salem Journal and Sentinel, which was a newspaper in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I think Carroll, he had not been fully employed for a while. And he and Peggy, by this time they had 2 children. And I think Peggy had just had a difficult third birth with a 3rd child who was born in 1948. And I think they wanted a quieter life. And so they were approached by Gordon Gray to see if Carroll wanted to become the executive editor of the Winston-Salem Journal and Sentinel. Now, the Winston-Salem Journal and Sentinel was a regional paper in North Carolina. Winston-Salem at the time was a very prosperous city because it housed R.J. Reynolds Tobacco and Haynes Hosiery, and it was a southern town. So it was a big change for them to go from the international life they had led to North Carolina at that point in time. This is 1949. So, and Peggy writes about that because Peggy was raised in around the world, but also was of a New England stock. And so she found it interesting to go be in the South at that time and to be in that kind of an environment. So that's what he did. He went and he became the editor of that paper. And I think he really reveled in it because it was going back to his UP days as a reporter. The newsroom back then was different from newsrooms today. And I try to capture that in the book. It was basically a lot of fun. And you had a lot of different characters and you could really investigate things. And he was actually quite happy there. But he continued to do consulting for the government on psychological warfare and other things. But that's basically what he did after the war.
Yeah, great kind of cap and ending to the book to see where his life brought him and where his career brought him even after the post-war years. So there was a quote that you had it on your website that was describing the book a little bit, and it was really moving and I think very, very appropriate for today, sort of where we're at with world affairs and contemporary events. And Carroll had made a comment that the Hitler legend would bear watching. And that really stuck out to me. What is it about that phrase that helps us to understand his legacy for reporting today, but also just understanding why he himself is important for understanding history, but also current events and contemporary affairs?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because I think it makes his life very relevant today. What he meant by the Hitler legend bears watching. He had developed several principles about reporting. And one of the principles that he published in the 1955 Neiman reports was what he called the tyranny of objectivity. And what he meant of that was that the media, the journalists, should not feel compelled to give both sides of an issue if one side is lying. And if you do print a lie, you have to print the context with in which the lie is reported and why it's a lie, okay? And he was writing in times of not Eugene McCarthy, but McCarthyism in 1955. And he felt the media had been complicit in the rise of McCarthy because McCarthy had said one big lie and the media had repeated, and then he'd say another big lie and the media would repeat it. And therefore, the more he lied, the more media attention he got, and the more popular he became to the general public. Okay, so I think we don't have to go far to see where that is today. And there's a big discussion now in the journalism community about objectivity and what that means. But basically, Carroll felt that a couple of principles. One, independence. Journalists need to be independent of money interests, which again is a problem today, especially in the TV media and the cable media news, I think. They had to put what they wrote in context. They didn't have to feel compelled to print a lie, put quote marks around a lie. He said that led to the half-truth, and that was really dangerous. They had to be responsible for what they wrote, and he believed that they should put the reader first and foremost, not corporate interests, not political ideology, but the reader and what the reader needed to know, and the reader would be able to make a good decision. But most tantamount was he didn't want the media to be used. And I think we are now, trust in the media is so low, and the industry itself is grappling with this lack of trust. And I think some of these basic principles are worth repeating and are worth younger journalists looking at. And the book has got a lot of very nice comments coming from working journalists, because I think they recognize that some of these principles we would do well to go back to in terms of how journalists report on the news. And when I was doing the book, I knew this was a relevant part of it. And I put in as much as I could, but it's not really a book about journalism. It's a biography of a journalist, but there are a lot of messages there that I hope would resonate, especially with young journalists. When I have spoken to journalism students, it's been very encouraging, because I think that Carroll saw journalism as a public service. How quaint, He didn't see it to become a star. He thought he did it so he could influence the community. He had a very well-known son, John Carroll, who became an editor who spoke about this as well. And I think if we can get back to that, I don't want to sound preachy, but if we get back to that and feeling you can have an influence on your community, then that is a very positive lesson to learn from his life.
Yeah, excellent. This is certainly a book that is, everyone should read it, but I feel certainly historians, people interested in this time period, and also, like you mentioned, journalists, there's so much to learn from his life and also this book. So I highly encourage everyone to go check it out, get a copy, learn more about his life and his legacy. And I would just like to thank you, Mary, for joining us today. This was a great conversation. So honored to have you here, and just really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you. And it really is an honor to speak with you and with the Institute, because what you guys are doing is so wonderful. And I really appreciate you wanting to talk to me about Wallace Carroll.
Absolutely. So thank you again, Mary, and thank you everyone for watching. And please continue to keep your eye out for some more in-person and virtual events at the museum, and hope everyone has a good day. Thank you.
Okay.